The monastery of San Sebastián del Silencio perched like a wounded bird on the barren hills of northern Spain, its ancient stones weathered by centuries of harsh winters and unforgiving winds. In the year 1855, 23 monks called this desolate place home, their days measured by the rhythm of prayer bells that echoed across the empty valleys below. Brother Mateo Vasquez had arrived at the monastery 3 years prior, a young man of 25 whose fervent devotion had impressed even the most seasoned clergy. His dark eyes burned with an intensity that made his fellow brothers uncomfortable during evening prayers, and his gaunt frame spoke of self-imposed fasting that went beyond the monastery's already strict regimen. The first vision came to him on a Tuesday in November, during Lauds in the pre-dawn darkness. As the brothers chanted in the candlelit chapel, Mateo suddenly collapsed, his body convulsing on the cold stone floor. When he finally stilled, his eyes remained open but unseeing, pupils dilated as if staring into an abyss. "Brother Mateo," whispered Father Domingo, the elderly abbot who knelt beside him. "What do you see?" Mateo's voice emerged as barely a whisper, yet it carried through the silent chapel with unnatural clarity. "I see nothing, Father. And in that nothing, I hear everything." The other monks exchanged worried glances. Brother Fernando, a stout man with graying temples, helped Mateo to his feet. The young monk's hands trembled as he gripped Fernando's robes, his fingernails having drawn blood from his own palms during the seizure. "The darkness speaks, Father," Mateo continued, his gaze fixed on something beyond the chapel walls. "It tells me that we have been praying to shadows, that true revelation comes not in light, but in the absence of it." Father Domingo's weathered face creased with concern. In his 40 years at San Sebastián, he had seen many young monks struggle with the isolation and harsh conditions, but never had he witnessed such disturbing episodes. "Come, my son. You need rest and warm broth." But Mateo pulled away, his movements sharp and erratic. "No, Father, I need to understand. The voice, it's not like anything in our scriptures. It doesn't promise salvation or damnation. It simply is." The chapel fell silent, except for the wind howling through the narrow windows. The other monks watched as Mateo stumbled toward the altar, his hands outstretched as if feeling his way through invisible obstacles. "Brother Mateo!" called Brother Carlos, a young monk who had befriended Mateo upon his arrival. "Please, come away from there." Mateo turned, and for a moment his eyes seemed to focus on Carlos with startling clarity. "Can you not hear it, Carlos? The silence between our prayers? That's where God truly dwells, not in our words, but in the spaces between them." Father Domingo approached slowly, his wooden staff clicking against the stone floor. "My son, visions can be gifts from the Almighty, but they can also be temptations from darker forces. We must pray for discernment." "I have prayed, Father," Mateo replied, his voice growing stronger. "I have prayed until my knees bled and my throat was raw. But the answers don't come in light. They come in darkness so complete that it becomes its own form of illumination." The abbot studied the young monk's face, noting the dark circles under his eyes and the way his hands continued to shake. "When did these visions begin?" 3 nights ago, Mateo admitted. "I was in my cell preparing for matins when suddenly the candle flame seemed to speak, not with words, but with shadows that danced on the walls. They showed me things, Father, terrible and beautiful things." Brother Fernando stepped forward, his voice gentle but firm. "What manner of things, brother?" Mateo's gaze drifted to the crucifix above the altar, and his expression grew troubled. "I saw our Lord on the cross, but his eyes were gone, Father, burned away. And from those empty sockets came a light brighter than the sun, a light that revealed truths too terrible for mortal sight." The chapel erupted in whispered prayers and signs of the cross. Father Domingo raised his hand for silence, but his own face had paled considerably. "You will confine yourself to your cell for 3 days. the abbot declared. "You will fast and pray for clarity. Brother Carlos will bring you water and bread at sunset. We will all pray for your soul, my son." Matteo nodded slowly, but as he turned to leave, he paused at the chapel door. "Father, what if the darkness I see is not evil? What if it's simply truth?" The question hung in the air long after Matteo's footsteps faded down the corridor. Father Domingo remained kneeling before the altar until dawn, praying for wisdom he feared might never come. In his cell, Matteo sat on his narrow cot, staring at the single candle that provided his only light. As the flame flickered in the draught from his small window, the shadows on the walls began to move again, forming shapes that seemed to whisper secrets older than the monastery itself. And in those whispers, Matteo began to understand what sacrifice would be required to truly see. The 3 days of confinement passed like a fever dream for Brother Matteo. Each night, the visions grew more vivid, more demanding. The shadows in his cell no longer merely danced. They spoke with voices that seemed to emanate from the very stones of the monastery. Brother Carlos faithfully delivered bread and water each evening, growing increasingly concerned by Matteo's appearance. The young monk's face had become gaunt, his cheeks hollow, and his dark eyes held a disturbing intensity that made Carlos avoid direct eye contact. "You must eat more, brother," Carlos urged on the second evening, noting that the previous day's bread remained untouched. "Your body needs sustenance." Matteo looked up from where he knelt on the stone floor, his knees raw and bleeding from hours of prayer. "The body is a vessel, Carlos, nothing more. It's the soul that requires nourishment, and mine hungers for truth." "What truth?" Carlos asked, setting down the wooden bowl of water. "What is it you seek that cannot be found in our scriptures?" Matteo rose slowly, his movements stiff from prolonged kneeling. He approached the small window that looked out over the desolate hills, now shrouded in winter mist. "Tell me, Carlos, when you pray, do you truly see God, or do you see only what you hope to see?" Carlos shifted uncomfortably. I feel his presence, in the prayers, in the communion, in the fellowship of our brothers." "But do you see him?" Matteo pressed, turning to face his friend. "Not feel, not hope, not believe, but truly see?" "God is not meant to be seen by mortal eyes, brother. That is the nature of faith." Matteo's laugh was bitter and hollow. "Faith. Yes, we cling to faith because we are too afraid to seek sight. But what if there was a way? What if the barrier between the mortal and divine could be removed?" Carlos backed toward the door, suddenly afraid. "Brother Matteo, these thoughts, they are dangerous. You speak of things that border on heresy." "Do I?" Matteo moved closer, his voice dropping to an urgent whisper. "Or do I speak of the ultimate devotion? Christ himself suffered for truth. He bled. He died. He sacrificed everything. What have we sacrificed, Carlos? What have any of us truly given up? We have given our lives to service, our bodies remain whole," Matteo interrupted. "Our eyes still see the material world. Our ears still hear earthly sounds. We have sacrificed nothing of consequence. We play at devotion while true revelation remains beyond our reach." Carlos fumbled for the door handle. I should inform Father Domingo of your condition. You are not well, brother." "I am more well than I have ever been," Matteo replied, but Carlos had already fled, his footsteps echoing down the corridor. Alone again, Matteo returned to his vigil. As darkness fell, the shadows began their nightly dance, and the whispers grew louder. They spoke of ancient practices, of mystics who had found ways to pierce the veil between worlds. They told him of saints who had mutilated their flesh to achieve divine visions, of hermits who had blinded themselves to see beyond the physical realm. On the third night, as the monastery slept, Matteo received his final vision. The darkness in his cell became absolute, swallowing even the faint starlight from his window. In that perfect blackness, a voice spoke, Not the whispers of shadows, but something far more profound. "You seek to see me," the voice said, neither male nor female, neither kind nor cruel. "But sight requires sacrifice. The eyes that see the world must be destroyed to see beyond it." "What must I do?" Matteo whispered into the darkness. "You know what must be done. The question is whether you have the courage to do it." When morning came, Brother Carlos arrived with bread and water to find Matteo sitting calmly on his cot, his hands folded in prayer. But there was something different about him, a stillness that seemed unnatural, as if he had made some momentous decision during the night. "Brother Matteo," Carlos called softly, "Father Domingo wishes to see you. Your confinement is ended." Matteo looked up, and Carlos was startled by the serenity in his expression. Gone was the fevered intensity of the previous days, replaced by an almost supernatural calm. "Yes," Matteo said simply, "it is time." They walked together through the monastery's corridors, past the cells of sleeping brothers, and through the cloister, where morning frost glittered on the stone walkways. Father Domingo waited in his study, a small chamber lined with theological texts and illuminated manuscripts. "Brother Matteo," the abbot said, rising from his desk, "you look better, more at peace." "I am at peace, Father," Matteo replied. "I have found clarity." "Good. Then perhaps we can put this troubling episode behind us. You will resume your duties, but I want you to speak with Brother Augustine about your visions. He has experience with such matters." Matteo nodded, but his eyes held a distant quality that made Father Domingo uneasy. "Of course, Father. But first, I would like to spend time in prayer, in the chapel, alone." The abbot hesitated. Something in Matteo's tone suggested this was not a request, but a statement of intent. "Very well, but Brother Carlos will check on you periodically." "That won't be necessary," Matteo said softly. "After tonight, I will need no supervision." As he left the study, Carlos caught his arm. "Matteo, what did you mean by that? What happens tonight?" Matteo smiled, and for a moment, he seemed like the earnest young monk who had first arrived at San Sebastian. "Tonight, Carlos, I finally see God." The words sent a chill through Carlos that he couldn't explain, but before he could respond, Matteo had already walked away, his footsteps echoing with a finality that suggested a journey from which there would be no return. The chapel of San Sebastian del Silencio had witnessed countless hours of prayer over its 3 centuries of existence, but never had its ancient stones felt the weight of such desperate devotion as they did that cold December night in 1855. Brother Matteo entered the sacred space as the last bell of Compline faded into silence. The other monks had retired to their cells, leaving him alone with the flickering votive candles and the imposing crucifix that dominated the altar. Moonlight filtered through the narrow windows, casting long shadows that seemed to reach toward him like beckoning fingers. He had spent the day in careful preparation, gathering what he would need for the ritual that the darkness had revealed to him. 2 oil lamps taken from the monastery's stores, iron rods from the forge where Brother Miguel repaired their simple tools, strips of cloth torn from his own robes to serve as bindings. Matteo knelt before the altar, his hands steady despite the magnitude of what he was about to attempt. The voice from his visions had been clear. True sight required the destruction of earthly vision. The eyes that perceived the material world must be burned away to reveal the divine realm beyond. "Lord," he whispered, his voice echoing in the empty chapel, "I offer this sacrifice not in despair, but in ultimate faith. Let my blindness become sight, my darkness become light." He lit the oil lamps with practiced movements, their flames casting dancing shadows on the walls. The iron rods, heated in the small brazier he had brought from the forge, glowed with an ominous red light. The metal had taken hours to reach the proper temperature, and even now, the heat radiating from them made the air shimmer. As Matteo prepared for his self-imposed ordeal, he reflected on the path that had brought him to this moment. His childhood in the poverty-stricken villages of Castile, where hunger and disease were constant companions. His calling to the religious life, driven by visions of divine purpose that had seemed so clear then, so simple. His years of study and prayer, always seeking but never finding the direct connection to the divine that his soul craved. The whispers in the darkness had shown him the truth, that all his prayers, all his devotion, all his sacrifice had been mere preparation for this ultimate act of faith. The saints of old had mortified their flesh, but none had dared what he was about to attempt. None had been willing to pay the price for true vision. "Brother Matteo," the voice startled him from his meditation. He turned to see Brother Carlos standing in the chapel doorway, his face pale in the lamplight. "Carlos," Matteo said calmly, "you should not be here." "I couldn't sleep," Carlos replied, stepping into the chapel. "I kept thinking about what you said earlier, about seeing God tonight. I was worried." His words trailed off as he noticed the iron rods glowing in the brazier, the strips of cloth, the purposeful arrangement of the oil lamps. "Matteo, what is this? What are you planning?" "I am planning to see," Matteo replied simply, "to truly see, for the first time in my life." Carlos's eyes widened with horror as understanding dawned. "No, Matteo, no. This is madness. This is not God's will." "How do you know?" Matteo asked, rising to his feet. "How can any of us know God's will when we see only shadows and reflections? The divine realm exists beyond our perception, Carlos. It requires sacrifice to reach it." "This is not sacrifice," Carlos said desperately, moving closer. "This is self-destruction. God does not ask us to mutilate ourselves." "Doesn't he?" Matteo's voice remained eerily calm. "Did he not ask Abraham to sacrifice his son? Did he not demand that Job suffer the loss of everything? Did he not require his own son to endure crucifixion? Sacrifice has always been the price of divine favor." Carlos reached for the iron rods, but Matteo caught his wrist with surprising strength. "You cannot stop this, my friend. It has already begun. The moment I heard the voice in the darkness, the moment I accepted its truth, this became inevitable." "What voice?" Carlos pleaded. "Matteo, listen to yourself. Voices in darkness are not divine revelation. They are symptoms of illness, of a mind pushed too far by isolation and fasting." Matteo smiled, and in that smile, Carlos saw something that chilled him to the bone, not madness, but absolute certainty. "You think me mad because you cannot hear what I hear, see what I see. But after tonight, I will see everything, Carlos. Everything that has been hidden from mortal eyes since the beginning of time." "Please," Carlos whispered, "if you have any love for our friendship, for the brotherhood we share, do not do this thing." For a moment, Matteo's expression softened, and Carlos glimpsed the earnest young monk he had known. "I do this because of love, Carlos. Love for truth, love for God, love for the divine mystery that calls to me from beyond the veil. You will understand in time. When you see what I become, what I am able to perceive, you will understand." Carlos turned and ran from the chapel, his footsteps echoing through the corridors as he raced toward Father Domingo's cell. But Matteo knew it was too late. The abbot was old and moved slowly, and by the time Carlos could wake him and explain the situation, the deed would be done. Alone again, Matteo knelt before the altar and picked up the first iron rod. The metal was white hot, radiating heat that made his face flush and his eyes water. He bound his left arm to prevent involuntary movement, then positioned the rod carefully. "Let this darkness become light," he whispered, and drove the burning iron into his left eye. The pain was beyond description, beyond human comprehension. It shot through his skull like lightning, setting every nerve ablaze. His scream echoed through the chapel and beyond, carrying across the hills like the cry of a damned soul. But even as agony consumed him, Matteo felt something else, a strange, terrible clarity, as if the destruction of his physical sight was opening pathways to perception he had never imagined. Through the haze of pain, he heard footsteps running toward the chapel, voices calling his name. But he could not stop now. With trembling hands, he reached for the second iron rod. "Let me see you," he gasped, and completed his horrific pact. The second scream shattered the monastery's ancient silence, and in its wake came something far worse, the sound of Brother Matteo laughing. Father Domingo burst into the chapel with Brother Carlos close behind, their faces illuminated by the hellish glow of the oil lamps. The sight that greeted them would haunt their dreams for the remainder of their lives. Brother Matteo knelt before the altar, his face turned upward toward the crucifix, blood streaming down his cheeks like crimson tears. Where his eyes had been, only charred, empty sockets remained, still smoking from the heat of the iron rods that lay discarded beside him. Yet despite the horrific mutilation, his lips were curved in a smile of absolute serenity. "Dear God in heaven," Father Domingo whispered, crossing himself repeatedly. "What have you done, my son?" Matteo turned his head toward the sound of the abbot's voice, and though he no longer possessed eyes, his movements were precise, as if he could see them perfectly. "Father," he said, his voice steady despite the trauma he had endured. "I can see you. I can see everything." Carlos fell to his knees, retching at the sight of his friend's mutilated face. "We must get Brother Augustine," he gasped. "He has some knowledge of healing. Perhaps—" "There is nothing to heal," Matteo interrupted, rising to his feet with fluid grace. "I am not wounded, Carlos. I am transformed." Father Domingo approached cautiously, his aged hands shaking as he reached for the strips of cloth Matteo had prepared. "We must bind these wounds, stop the bleeding. You need immediate care." "Do I appear to be in distress, Father?" Matteo asked, tilting his head slightly. The bleeding had already begun to slow, and his breathing was calm and regular. "Do I seem to be suffering?" The abbot paused, studying the young monk's demeanor. Despite the horrific nature of his injuries, Matteo showed none of the signs of shock or agony that should have accompanied such trauma. His posture was erect, his voice clear, his movements controlled. "The pain will come," Father Domingo said uncertainly. "When the shock wears off, there is no pain," Matteo replied. "Only clarity, only sight beyond sight." He turned toward Carlos, who was still kneeling on the stone floor. "Stand up, my friend. Look at me. Really look at me." Carlos forced himself to meet Matteo's eyeless gaze, and what he saw there made him stumble backward. The empty sockets seemed to hold depth, as if they were windows into some vast, unknowable space. And in that space, something moved. Not light, but the absence of light given form and purpose. "You see it too, don't you?" Matteo said softly. "The change has already begun." Brother Fernando arrived at that moment, drawn by the screams that had echoed through the monastery. He took one look at the scene and immediately began organizing the other monks who had gathered in the corridor. "Brother Augustine, bring your medical supplies. Brother Miguel, help me prepare a stretcher. We must get him to the infirmary immediately." But when they turned back to Matteo, he had moved to the altar and was running his hands over the ancient stone surface with reverent care. "The craftsmanship is exquisite," he murmured. "I can see every chisel mark, every grain of the stone. The mason who carved this was named Rodrigo, and he wept as he worked, mourning a daughter lost to fever." The monks exchanged bewildered glances. The altar had been carved centuries before any of them were born, and no records existed of its creation. "How could you possibly know that?" Father Domingo asked. Matteo smiled, his fingers tracing patterns invisible to the others. "Because I can see the echoes, Father. Every emotion, every thought, every prayer that has touched this stone has left its mark. The past is not gone. It simply exists in a realm beyond normal perception." He moved to one of the wooden pews, his movements confident despite his blindness. Brother Thomas sat here during morning prayers on the day he decided to leave the monastery. He was thinking of a woman named Isabella, wondering if love was a greater calling than devotion. Mateo's head turned toward Brother Thomas, who stood pale and shaken in the doorway. "You never told anyone about her, did you, Thomas?" Brother Thomas fled without a word, and several other monks began backing away from Mateo with expressions of fear and revulsion. "This is not divine revelation," Father Domingo declared, his voice shaking. "This is something else entirely, something unholy." "Is truth unholy, Father?" Mateo asked, approaching the crucifix. "Is knowledge of God's creation somehow evil?" He reached up and touched the carved feet of Christ, and his expression grew troubled. "But this is wrong." "What do you mean?" Carlos asked, despite his fear. Mateo's fingers traced the figure on the cross, and his smile faded. "This is not how it happened. The suffering, yes, but the purpose. We have misunderstood the purpose." His voice grew distant, as if he were seeing something far beyond the chapel. "He did not die for our sins. He died to show us the way to see beyond the veil, to sacrifice the flesh for the spirit, to trade earthly sight for divine vision." "Blasphemy," Father Domingo breathed. "You speak blasphemy." "I speak truth," Mateo replied, turning to face the assembled monks. "And truth is often indistinguishable from blasphemy to those who lack the courage to see it." Brother Augustine finally arrived with his medical supplies, but stopped short when he saw Mateo's condition. "Dear Lord," he whispered, "what manner of madness is this?" "Not madness," Mateo said, though Augustine had spoken barely above a whisper from across the chapel. "Enlightenment, and it is only the beginning." As if to emphasize his words, the votive candles throughout the chapel suddenly flared, their flames reaching toward the ceiling in defiance of natural law. The temperature in the room dropped noticeably, and several monks reported later that they could see their breath misting in the suddenly frigid air. "The barriers are weakening," Mateo observed with satisfaction. "My sacrifice has opened a door, and things are beginning to pass through. Soon you will all see what I see. Soon the entire world will understand." Father Domingo made the sign of the cross and began reciting the Lord's Prayer, but his words seemed to have no effect on the supernatural phenomena manifesting around them. If anything, the candle flames grew higher, and a sound like distant whispers began to emanate from the very walls of the chapel. "Pray if it comforts you, Father," Mateo said gently, "but know that your prayers are heard by something far greater and more terrible than the God you think you worship, the entity that spoke to me in the darkness, that guided me to this moment. It has been listening to human prayers for millennia, waiting for someone with the courage to pay the price for true communion." "What have you done?" Carlos whispered, tears streaming down his face. "Mateo, what have you done to us all?" Mateo's ruined face turned toward his friend, and in the depths of his empty sockets, Carlos saw something that made his soul recoil in horror. Not darkness, but a light so alien and terrible that human minds were never meant to perceive it. "I have opened their eyes," Mateo replied, "just as I have opened mine." In the days following Brother Mateo's horrific transformation, the monastery of San Sebastián del Silencio became a place where the natural order seemed to bend and twist like heated metal. The ancient stones themselves appeared to pulse with an otherworldly energy, and the very air grew thick with an oppressive presence that made breathing difficult. Father Domingo had ordered Mateo confined to his cell, but the young monk's influence seemed to seep through the walls like a contagion. Brothers reported strange dreams, filled with visions of burning eyes, and voices that spoke in languages that predated human speech. During morning prayers, several monks found themselves speaking words they didn't recognize, their tongues moving of their own accord to form syllables that seemed to resonate with the stone walls. Brother Carlos had taken it upon himself to care for Mateo, bringing him food and water despite his growing terror of what his friend had become. Each visit revealed new impossibilities that challenged everything Carlos believed about the nature of reality. "You don't need to bring me food," Mateo said on the fourth day, though Carlos had entered the cell in complete silence. "I no longer hunger for earthly sustenance." Carlos set down the wooden bowl with trembling hands. "You must eat something. Your body—" "My body is changing," Mateo interrupted, rising from his meditation position on the floor. "Can you not see it, Carlos? Look at me, really look." Despite his revulsion, Carlos forced himself to study his friend's appearance. Mateo's face had indeed changed since the night of his self-mutilation. The charred sockets where his eyes had been were healing with unnatural speed, but instead of scar tissue, the skin appeared to be growing translucent, as if something beneath was trying to push through. His hair, once dark brown, now showed streaks of silver that seemed to move and shift in the candlelight. "What is happening to you?" Carlos whispered. "I am becoming what I was always meant to be," Mateo replied. "A bridge between worlds, a conduit for truths that mortal minds cannot comprehend." "But I am not the only one changing, am I, Carlos?" Carlos's hand instinctively went to his throat, where a strange mark had appeared 3 days earlier, a symbol that looked like an eye surrounded by flames. He had told no one about it, but somehow Mateo knew. "It burns sometimes, doesn't it?" Mateo continued, "especially during prayers. The mark is a sign, Carlos. You have been chosen to witness what comes next." "Chosen by what?" Carlos demanded, his fear giving way to anger. "What entity speaks to you in the darkness? What have you brought into this holy place?" Mateo's lipless smile was terrible to behold. "Holy? This place was built on older foundations, Carlos. Foundations that predate Christianity by centuries. The monks who first came here thought they were claiming pagan ground for God, but they were wrong. They were simply returning home." As if summoned by his words, the temperature in the cell plummeted. Carlos's breath misted in the suddenly frigid air, and frost began forming on the stone walls. From somewhere deep within the monastery came the sound of chanting, not the familiar Latin prayers of the brothers, but something far older and more primal. "The others are beginning to understand," Mateo observed with satisfaction. Brother Thomas was the first to fully embrace the truth. "Would you like to see what he has become?" Before Carlos could respond, footsteps echoed in the corridor outside. The cell door opened, and Brother Thomas entered, or what had once been Brother Thomas. His eyes had been replaced by swirling voids that seemed to contain entire galaxies, and when he spoke, his voice carried harmonics that made the stone walls vibrate. "The pilgrims have arrived," Thomas announced in his transformed voice. 12 souls seeking spiritual guidance. "They do not yet know what guidance they will receive." Carlos backed against the wall, his heart pounding. "What pilgrims? No one was expected." "They were called," Mateo explained, rising to his feet with fluid grace. "Just as I was called to sacrifice my sight, they have been called to witness the birth of a new age. The entity that speaks through the darkness has been patient, Carlos. It has waited centuries for the right moment, the right vessel, the right congregation." Through the small window of the cell, Carlos could see figures approaching the monastery through the winter mist. They moved with the mechanical precision of sleepwalkers, their faces blank and their eyes reflecting an inner light that had nothing to do with human consciousness. "Stop this," Carlos pleaded. "Whatever you've started, whatever you've awakened, you can still stop it. Pray for forgiveness. Seek redemption." "Redemption?" Mateo laughed, and the sound was like breaking glass. "Carlos, my dear friend, you still don't understand. There is nothing to redeem. What I have done, what we are becoming, this is not corruption. It is evolution. Humanity has spent millennia crawling in the darkness, praying to gods they cannot see, hoping for salvation they do not deserve. But now, finally, their prayers are being answered." The chanting from below grew louder, and Carlos recognized the voices of his fellow monks. But the words they spoke were not Latin or Spanish. They were something far older, syllables that seemed to bypass the ears and resonate directly in the bones. "Father Domingo," Carlos said desperately. "Where is Father Domingo?" "The good father is leading the ceremony," Thomas replied, his void eyes swirling with cosmic fire. He was resistant at first, but the truth has a way of making itself known, especially to those who have devoted their lives to seeking it. Carlos ran from the cell, his footsteps echoing through corridors that seemed to stretch longer than they should. The monastery's familiar layout had become a maze of shadows and impossible angles, as if the very architecture was reshaping itself according to some alien geometry. He found Father Domingo in the chapel, kneeling before the altar alongside the other monks. But the elderly abbot's face had been transformed by an expression of rapture so intense it bordered on madness. His lips moved in constant prayer, but the words that emerged were not from any Christian liturgy. The pilgrims had arranged themselves in a circle around the monks, their blank faces turned toward the crucifix above the altar. But the carved figure of Christ was changing, its features shifting and flowing like molten wax. The crown of thorns had become a halo of flame, and where the Savior's eyes should have been, empty sockets gazed down with the same terrible absence that marked Mateo's transformed face. "Father," Carlos called out, but Domingo did not respond. None of the monks responded. They were lost in their communion with something that wore the mask of divinity, but possessed a hunger that was entirely alien. Carlos turned to flee, but found his path blocked by Brother Mateo, who had somehow appeared in the chapel without making a sound. The transformed monk's eyeless sockets seemed to bore into Carlos's soul, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of cosmic authority. "You cannot run from truth, Carlos," Mateo said gently. "You cannot hide from what you have already seen. The mark on your throat burns because it recognizes its purpose. You are to be the witness, the one who carries word of what transpires here to the world beyond these walls." "I won't," Carlos whispered. "I won't be part of this madness." "You already are," Mateo replied, and Carlos felt the mark on his throat flare with searing heat. "The moment you looked into my transformed face, the moment you saw the truth behind the veil, you became connected to what we are becoming. You will leave this place, Carlos. You will walk into the world and speak of what you have witnessed, and those who hear your words will be drawn here, just as the pilgrims were drawn. The circle will expand, the truth will spread, and humanity will finally see with eyes unclouded by false hope." Carlos tried to speak, to deny what Mateo was saying, but found that his voice had been stolen. The mark on his throat pulsed with alien fire, and he understood with growing horror that his fate had been sealed the moment he had chosen to care for his transformed friend. As the chanting reached a crescendo and the very air began to shimmer with otherworldly energy, Carlos realized that the monastery of San Sebastián del Silencio would never again know silence. It had become something else entirely, a beacon calling to those who sought truth, regardless of the price. And he would be the one to carry that call into the world. 3 months had passed since the night Brother Mateo burned away his earthly sight, and the monastery of San Sebastián del Silencio had become something that defied both description and comprehension. The ancient stones now pulsed with a rhythm that matched no human heartbeat, and the very air shimmered with energies that made reality itself seem negotiable. Brother Carlos stood at the edge of the monastery grounds, his traveling pack secured to his shoulders and his face marked by the terrible knowledge he now carried. The symbol on his throat had grown more pronounced over the weeks, its flame-wreathed eye now visible even through his robes. He had fought against his ordained purpose for as long as possible, but the compulsion had become too strong to resist. Behind him, the monastery had transformed into something that belonged more to nightmare than to the waking world. The bell tower stretched impossibly high into the grey sky, its peak lost in clouds that moved against the wind. The walls themselves seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting with a life of their own. And from every window, every doorway, every crack in the stone, an otherworldly light seeped out like luminous blood. "You understand now," came a voice from behind him. Carlos turned to see Brother Mateo approaching, his transformation now complete. Where once a man had stood, something far more terrible and magnificent had taken his place. His skin had become translucent, revealing networks of light that pulsed beneath the surface. His empty eye sockets now contained swirling galaxies of stars, and when he moved, reality seemed to bend around him like heated glass. "I understand that you have damned us all," Carlos replied, his voice hoarse from weeks of screaming prayers that went unanswered. "Damned?" Mateo's laugh was like the sound of distant thunder. "Carlos, my dear friend, you still think in terms of salvation and damnation, but those are human concepts, limited by human understanding. What we have become transcends such simple categorizations." Carlos looked back at the monastery one final time. Through the chapel windows, he could see the congregation that had gathered over the past months. Pilgrims continued to arrive daily, drawn by dreams and visions they couldn't explain. They came seeking spiritual guidance and found something far more profound and far more terrible. Father Domingo now served as the high priest of their transformed order, his aged body sustained by energies that flowed from the entity that had spoken to Mateo in the darkness. The other monks had become conduits for truths that human language could not express, their voices joining in harmonies that resonated across dimensions. "What am I supposed to tell them?" Carlos asked. "The people I encounter, the authorities who will question me. What words could possibly convey what has happened here?" "You will not need words," Mateo replied, reaching out to touch Carlos's shoulder. Where his fingers made contact, Carlos felt a surge of alien knowledge flow into his mind. "The mark you bear will speak for you. Those who are ready to hear the truth will be drawn to you, just as you were drawn to witness our transformation. And through you, they will find their way here." Carlos shuddered as visions flashed through his consciousness. Images of cities where the mark would appear on the throats of the faithful, of churches where congregations would begin speaking in the ancient tongue, of a world slowly awakening to the presence that had always lurked just beyond the veil of human perception. "How many?" he whispered. "How many will you claim?" "All of them, eventually," Mateo replied with serene certainty. "Humanity has prayed for revelation for millennia, Carlos. They have begged to see the face of God, to know divine truth, to transcend their mortal limitations. We are simply answering their prayers." A sound like distant singing drifted from the monastery, but the melody was composed of frequencies that human ears were never meant to perceive. Carlos felt the mark on his throat respond to the otherworldly music, pulsing with heat that spread through his entire body. "Go now," Mateo commanded. And Carlos found his feet moving of their own accord. "Carry our truth into the world. Let them know that the age of blind faith is ending, and the age of terrible sight has begun." As Carlos walked down the mountain path, he could feel the monastery's influence following him like a shadow. The mark on his throat would ensure that he could never truly escape what he had witnessed, never find peace in ignorance or forgetfulness. He was bound to his purpose as surely as Mateo was bound to his transformed existence. Behind him, the monastery continued its impossible growth, its towers reaching toward heavens that no longer seemed quite so distant. The entity that had spoken to Mateo in the darkness was patient, but its patience was not infinite. It had waited centuries for the right moment to begin its emergence into the physical realm, and now that emergence was accelerating. In the months and years that followed, Carlos would become a legend of sorts. the mad monk who appeared in villages and cities across Spain, speaking of visions that drove men to madness and women to ecstasy. Some who heard his words would dismiss him as a lunatic. Others would feel the mark begin to burn on their own throats and know that they had been chosen for something greater than their mortal understanding could encompass. And one by one, they would make their way to the monastery of San Sebastián del Silencio, where Brother Mateo waited with his terrible gift of sight. They would come seeking answers to questions they didn't know how to ask, and they would find truths that would transform them in ways both wonderful and horrifying. The monastery's influence spread like ripples in a dark pond, touching lives across continents and centuries. Scholars would write of the strange epidemic of religious mania that swept through Europe in the latter half of the 19th century. Theologians would debate the meaning of the flame-wreathed eye symbol that appeared in churches from Madrid to Moscow. And in the deepest archives of the Vatican, documents would be sealed away that spoke of a monastery where the very nature of divine revelation had been forever changed. But Brother Mateo's cell remained exactly as it had been on that first night of his transformation, a simple stone chamber with a single window that looked out over the desolate hills. The smell of scorched flesh never left those walls, just as the memory of his sacrifice never left the consciousness of those who had witnessed it. And in that cell, on quiet nights when the wind carried whispers from realms beyond human comprehension, visitors could still hear the echo of Mateo's final words before he drove the burning iron into his eyes. "Let me see you." The entity that had answered that prayer continued to watch through the empty sockets of its chosen vessel, patient and eternal, waiting for the day when all of humanity would finally see with eyes unclouded by the illusions of mortal sight. The pact had been made. The price had been paid, and the revelation was only beginning. In the archives of the Spanish Inquisition, a single document remains that speaks of the monastery of San Sebastián del Silencio. It is written in a hand that trembles with either fear or madness, and it ends with these words: "The cell has been sealed by order of His Holiness, but the seal bears the mark of the flame-wreathed eye. We fear that what was meant to contain has instead become a doorway. God help us all, for we have looked upon the face of something that wears His mask, but serves a hunger far older than creation itself." The document is dated December 15th, 1856. It is signed by Brother Carlos Mendoza, the last surviving witness to the transformation of Brother Mateo Vasquez. The monastery still stands, though no official records acknowledge its existence. And sometimes, on the coldest nights of winter, travelers in the hills of northern Spain report seeing lights in its windows and hearing voices raised in songs that predate human language. The cell remains sealed. The smell of scorched flesh lingers still,